Hello students, in this module we are going to study about the events of the World War, the First World War we are doing. So in this regards we'll see various wars that played an important role during the First World War. So the first thing is war on the Western Front. On the Western Front, it was basically the German armies and they were swept across Belgium and then they entered the southern France. So now when they came across the French army posed such a threat to them that they had to retreat. And after that, for the next 4 years, neither the French army could move any further nor the Germans. So over here we might say it was a deadlock for both the countries, but moreover it was a total washover for the Germans because they had various plans of defeating the French and then moving forward. But since it turned out to be a deadlock in the Battle of Marne, so finally they were there and they had all their plannings ruined, and as a result France was able to ruin the plans of world capturing and proving themselves powerful. This was the plan of Germans, so they were proved wrong, and it was French who were able to stop them at a particular point. Another important war that took place during this time was the Trench War. Now when we are talking about Trench War, it was a difficult scenario as the whole scenario we talk about, because during this time the entire world, all the countries, those who were involved in this particular war, they all had the capabilities of killing anyone even if from a distance. So the wars turned out to be totally different in scenario, because now there were hardly people those who were there physically visible on the battlegrounds. Rather, they were not on the battlegrounds, they were in the battlegrounds, because that means they had dug the trenches over there and the soldiers were supposed to be inside those trenches so that they are least visible to their opponent, especially if they are on the ground. Aerial, obviously they will be able to see it, but on the ground the opponents were not able to see the people, those who were lying inside the trenches. These were the small areas which were made on the grounds, under which all the soldiers were supposed to be keeping a watch over there. From there they were in the pathetic conditions, they were totally under the ground, they had the lice, rats, poison and gas, cold, cough, even all those conditions having over there. Even sometimes when the soldiers killed, the dead bodies could not be removed, so they had to stay over there with the dead bodies. And moreover, if there were snow or other such conditions, floods, then these particular trenches turned out to be muddy graves for these soldiers. So these were the different scenario of the warfare during this time. Another important thing was the war on the Eastern Front. Earlier we have done in the Western Front, where Germany and France were you can say collided with each other. Here we can say in the Eastern Front, it was in August 1914. Fighting began on the Eastern Front with the invasion of Russia by Austria-Hungarian, and Germany and Austria succeeded in repulsing the Russian attack. So when Russia attacked, obviously we know that Austria-Hungarian was the empire which was always friendly with the Germans, and so Germany came to rescue them, and Germans and Austria-Hungarian, they were together and they were against the Russians. So they were able to oppose a proper opposition against Russian attacks, and finally Russia's attacks were stopped. They were able to successfully outdo the Russians. Moreover, they were successful against Romania, Serbia and Italy also, and that is how they were able to form a very strong alliance. Outside Europe, there were campaigns which were even similar in cases. They were like against the Ottoman Empire in Palestine, Mesopotamia and Arabia and other such places. At the same time, in the Eastern Front, Japan was also able to occupy German positions, and France and Britain, they seized most of the German colonies in Africa. So African part, all the colonies of Germans were being attacked by Britain and France. They were trying to capture those, whereas on the other side it was Japan who was trying to capture all the eastern colonies of German in the eastern part in Asia and Africa as well. So that is how it was more of a war of proving oneself mightier than the other by extending their power, extending their area of rule, annexing more and more colonies under them, their control. So that is how this entire scenario changed the warfare during this time, the war on the Eastern Front. Next we see the policy of blockade. Policy of blockade was, you can say, Germany was able to use all the submarines in the warfare, and they were able to destroy most of the warship of the Britain as well as France. So as a result, in the Battle of Verdun, the French defeated the Germans, and after that it was the English who tightened the entire coast of the Germans. They blocked it, and so they did not let any of the submarines pass from there, and that is how most of the submarine attacks of Germans were controlled by the British in this way, with the British and French army coming together. And that is why we can say this policy of blockade turned out to be beneficial for France, Britain, to have a strict control over the Germans. After this we see, now it turns out to be an important point that we are taking up, that is entry of the USA in the war. So far it was USA was not actively involved in the war, because moreover USA had nothing to fight for, nothing to be against for, and they were totally away from this particular thing. They had a moreover soft corner towards the British also, although they knew that British is superpower and they are trying to increase their power by adding more colonies. But still they had a you can say a soft corner for them, and it was one of the German U-boats. It sunk one of British you can say cruise ship, thinking it to be a warship. It was sunk by the German U-boat, and this particular boat was Lusitania. Now under this incident we can say that Lusitania, there were 1153 passengers, out of which those who were killed, out of which 128 were Americans, and this was, being a cruise ship, had nothing to do with the war. So when this particular incident took place, it was out of soft corner, out of being a supporter of British. America was totally against Germany, and they knew what were the German you can say mindset is, to prove themselves a superpower and have their particular control over the world. So they did not want to have that also. Moreover, as you can say, avenging the death of their own people. So these were various reasons which made USA attack Germany, and that is how we can say that USA got an active participation. USA made an active participation in the First World War. Besides this, while we are talking about entry of USA, another important point under this particular events is exit of USSR, that is exit of Russia. So we can say that another major improvement or development that took place in 1917 was withdrawal of Russia from the World War. Remember, it was the first nation which got into conflicts from 1914 till 1917. For the 4 years it kept on fighting, 1914, 15, 16 and 17. Then after that we can say at that time it was over 6 lakh Russian soldiers were killed by this time in this World War. And the day after the Bolshevik government came to power, under the leadership of Lenin, it issued that decrees of peace and all the treaties will be signed, and Russia finally surrendered, in a way you can say, to the World War, to all the other allied you can say countries or group of countries which were on the winning side. Then comes Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Brest-Litovsk was a treaty which was signed between Russia and Germany. It is very important for you to remember this. What was the important treaty signed by them? It was a peace treaty which was signed between Germany and Russia, known as Brest-Litovsk, and you have to remember the date. It was in 1918. Then comes the end of the war. By 1918, the things started mending up in a good way, and the war scenario was about to come to an end. Britain, France and USA launched a military offense or military attack on Germany, and finally Germany could not withstand that, and it had to collapse. And her allies began to collapse. It was political discontent started arising in Austria-Hungarian Empire and Germany also. Bulgaria withdrew from the war, and so even Turkey also surrendered. These were all the Balkan countries, and German and Austro-Hungarian, they were all together, and they started breaking apart against the tough competition they had from the group of you can say Britain, France and Britain, France and USA. It was the new German government signed an armistice on November 11, 1918. The number of persons who fought in the war was somewhere around 50 to 73 million, 53 to 70 million people, and the total number of those who were killed was almost considered to be 9 million, out of which we know that 6 million were the Russians itself. So we can say active participation and active tragic ends of the soldiers was in the account of Russia. Next, we see that besides these terrible human losses, the economy of most of the countries, those who were the superpowers also, even their economy turned out to be, you can say, much adverse effect was seen over there. They were adversely affected, and as a result we see a global economic depression took place somewhere around 1929 to 30, because obviously we know 1919 it came to an end, but for the next 10 years the situation, they tried mending it up but they could not, and the situation turned from bad to worse. And finally from 1929 to 1930, that 1 year was a proper era of economic depression, and it gave rise to various social problems also, not in one particular country or the winning or the losing country. Winning or losing had hardly mattered at that time. It was every nation who was involved was suffering through this particular thing. Even we see that British was on the winning side. They had a, you can say, very strong and very considering victory over the entire nation, all the other countries, but still they were the ones who suffered a lot of economic loss. Then we see what were the results of the war. Now here we see the first and the most important thing that we need to understand in this chapter is the Treaty of Versailles. I'll read it for you. It is signed on June 28, 1919. So the victorious powers or the allies means a group or union of all the countries. So the victorious powers met in a conference which was at a place called Merciless, a suburb of Paris, and later in Paris between January to June 1919. So again and again they had meetings over there in Merciless, a particular area in Paris, and then proper Paris area. So though a number of countries represented at the conference was though the number of total countries those who were present in this conference were 27 of them, the terms of the peace treaties were really decided by here are the important names: Woodrow Wilson, President of US at that time; Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Britain; and George Clemenceau, which is Prime Minister of France. So we know USA, Britain, France, these were the important areas who won the that particular scenario. They had their alliance, USA, Britain and France. As a result, they turned out to be the victorious three, and they were the important people, the prime ministers and the presidents of these areas. They turned out to be the important people to decide all the terms of peace treaty, which was the Treaty of Versailles. The defeated countries were not represented at the conference. The victorious powers also excluded Russia from the conference. Russia withdrew. They were obviously together with Britain and France, but later they signed peace treaties and they were totally neutral from here. So even in Treaty of Versailles also, they were not involved in that particular meeting, whatever the decision making was supposed to be taken there. As a result of the discussion at the Paris conference on June 28, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Now it ended the war. Everything came to you can say not normal, but obviously the war situation came to an end, and that is why we can say it came to normal. But after with this, we can say the repercussions or the outcome of this particular treaty were deadly, not in the instantly, but in the near future they turned out, obviously we know it led to the Second World War, so that became even more deadlier. So here we see what were the terms of the treaty which made the things more aggravated the situation. It is, the treaty declared Germany as the guilty of aggression. Entire World War was started because of Germany. They were blamed for everything. Germany was supposed to pay all the money for the reparation of the war losses, whatever the things, outcome of the war has been faced by various countries. And that amount, we are talking about 1919. At that time, they were supposed to pay an amount of $33 billion to all the entire winning countries as well as the other nations who have suffered a loss. Besides that, the area of the Rhine Valley, which was in Germany, was to be demilitarized, and the German territory west of Rhine was to be occupied by the Allied troops. That means one of the countries from the winning troop. For the next 15 years, it will be taken by them. Germany lost Alsace-Lorraine to France. That means France took over that particular territory. Eupen et Malmedy was given to Belgium. That was also on the Allied side. Schleswig was given to Denmark. So all these areas of German territories were supposed to be divided and given to the various winning Allied countries. Then Germany ceded parts of her pre-war territories to Denmark, Belgium, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France. So it was like the entire German was divided into various fragments, and all these fragments were distributed as a reward to all the other nations to take over for the next 10-15 years. And that is how German power, German dream of world domination was totally crushed by USA, Britain and France, in a way we can say, as the Allied powers or the winning powers. They did everything they could to break down the spirit of Germans. Next other thing is the coal mines of German area near the Saar Valley. They were taken by France for the next 15 years, so that whatever money can be taken from there, that will give as a reparation to the France. Germany lost all her colonies to the Allies. All the colonies of Germany were distributed to Britain, Belgium, South Africa, as well as to Portugal. So they were left without any colonies also, through which they can get any other, you can say, benefit or social or resource advantage. German colonies in the Pacific areas were taken over by China and were taken over by Japan. Its control over Chinese colonies were also given to Japan. The German army was also under restriction, and under this restriction they were not supposed to have more than a force of 1 lakh soldiers. Navy was limited to only 15,000 men and only 24 ships. They could not have any more than this. The air force and submarines were totally banned. So they were not able to have any particular strong army or defense force. That means they were totally bound that they cannot be preparing for any war in the near future, and that is how it was like totally breaking down the German spirit. The treaty affirmed the complete independence of Belgium, Poland, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia from the German control. And the covenant of the League of Nations was added to the Treaty of Versailles. Like today we have UN, but earlier, before UN, it was the League of Nations. All the nations combined together will have you can say the world scenario will take over the problems in various countries. So that League of Nations was also added into the Treaty of Versailles, that if any particular country has any problem, they can go to the League of Nations, and then all the important nations will come and they will decide about that particular matter. But the major problem over here in League of Nations was the big countries were not a part of it, like USA, USSR, Britain. The superpowers were not a part of it, and that is the reason why most of the countries, they did whatever they wanted to do, and League of Nations did not take any active participation in controlling that. They just passed summons and nobody did care about that, and that is why it turned out to be a useless organization which could not do much. And even the big nations were not at all ready to listen to it or ready to initiate any particular decisive role over there. So that was the reason why League of Nations failed, and then finally they had to decide for a United Nations organization, but that is much later, somewhere around after Second World War, you can say. Next we talk about the other important result or consequence of the World War was the rearrangement, territorial rearrangement. So period after the war saw the end of the European supremacy in the world. Till now it was all the European countries, but now we see that after this particular war, USA turned out to be economically and in every particular way ahead of Europe, as well as you can say the entire Europe, or Britain especially. Britain was the superpower. The peace treaty signed after the war transformed the political map of the world, and particularly of Europe. 3 ruling dynasties were totally destroyed after the First World War or during the First World War. They were the Romanov of the Russian Empire, and then it was Hohenzollern in Germany, as well as we can say the Habsburg in Austria-Hungarian Empire. So these were the 3 main you can say dynasties which were totally removed. Later onwards, we can say the Ottoman Empire in Turkey was also no longer in existence, and that also came to an end. Besides that, you can say most of the nations which were together till now, they were broken. They broke into different new nations. Those who were under the colonization, they were given proper freedom. Many nations got their freedom. Many new nations were formed, and these included Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, all of them. Even under the impulse of nationalism, Alsace-Lorraine was restored to France, and Schleswig-Holstein was restored to Denmark. These were the areas which were taken by Germans, but then after the war, after Treaty of Merciless, they were given back to France and Denmark. So that is how it was totally a rearrangement of territories done after the World War, and many new nations came into existence. Many empires or imperial nations broke into new parts or new nations, and many different scenarios in pre-war changed after this post-war situation. So that is how the entire territories were totally newly formed, or new boundaries were set after this. Lastly, we see the formation of the League of Nations. As I told you, an important decision was made that to avoid any further war, we will have a particular group of all the countries coming together to form a League of Nations, so that they should take care of all such particular disputes and arising situations which might threat the peace and harmony of the world. But later onwards, we do see that League of Nations lack of the important big powers, big countries, and no proper initiative taken to stop the aggressiveness of any of the nation. Because of that, nobody cared about whatever summons were given to them by League of Nations, and as a result, League of Nations failed in controlling the situation. As we can say, well, that after just 20 years of that, again the Second World War took place, and when it took place, it was even worse, because more nations and with more deadly weapons were ready to fight or have a combat with each other. Lastly, we have in the chapter aims and objectives of the League of Nations. We are just supposed to do the important points of this, so I'll read it out. All states of the world were prohibited from entering into any secret treaties. Every now and then they would have secret treaties, and with the secret treaties they would prepare for war, dispute, and all those things. So everyone was supposed to be prohibited from entering into any secret treaty. The member states were not supposed to maintain huge armies. All the states of the League of Nations, they were not supposed to have huge standing armies. That means they should not be like posing a threat to any other neighboring country for the war. All states were to respect each other's independence and should not interfere in their personal policy making or judgment or any particular way of ruling their country. All states were to refer their mutual disputes, if any, to the League of Nations, and all the member states or member countries, they will decide about that particular dispute and actively take part in controlling the situation which might be adverse. The member states were to take necessary action as directed by the League of Nations against any state which tried to disturb the peace and order of the world. So they were supposed to take active part, and all the states were supposed to decide upon what to be done with that particular situation, also with that country. But we do see later onwards that it did not happen as it was planned. Apart from political functions, the League of Nations was supposed to promote cultural, social, and economic cooperation among the member states also. So the member states could also support this particular organization culturally, socially, economically, so that everybody can come together and have close association. But since many nations hardly cared about it, so this did not happen, and therefore everybody kept themselves aloof from this to most of the extent whenever their personal policies, personal affairs were concerned, and therefore they were least bothered in getting into somebody else's dispute and managing it and doing it, and proper functioning of League of Nations could not be done. So that was the reason why League of Nations failed. So after this, we see the rise of dictatorship in Italy and Germany led to the weakening of the League of Nations, and it failed in its objective because of maintaining peace, because most of the nations did not pay attention to the grave situations which were arising during this time in Italy and Germany. And later onwards, whatever they did, they broke all the rules of League of Nations. Nobody said anything. League of Nations kept on passing summons, but obviously Italy and Germany hardly cared about it, and that is why in the next chapter we will see the rise of dictatorship, that is fascism and Nazism. So with this we come to the end of this video, and we have finished this chapter also. So with this we have come to the end of the First World War. After this, in next video we will be doing chapter 11, Rise of Dictatorship. So with this we end this video.